Hello. In this segment, I'd like to address the question of globalism and world order. In previous segments, we identified basically 19 issues with regard to globalism, including population and population growth, resources, energy, and food and water, and its scarcity in some areas, the question of environment and environmental pollution, trade, investment, and finance, human rights, and a number of other issues. We noted that population has increased sevenfold, basically within the last 200 years, from 1 billion to 7 billion this time. And annually, approximately 100 million are added to this number, which comes to about 1 billion every 10 to 12 years, if this trend continues, and puts pressure on resources and the question of environment and security and global balance, and many of these issues. We indicated that the world population growth is primarily in developing and underdeveloped nations. The population of Western democracies has basically stabilized. And then another dangerous trend with regard to population growth is that in many Middle Eastern countries, and particularly in China and then India, the number of men are significantly more than women. And in the next several years, that number would increase to the extent of men being 20% or so more than women. If that happens, that would be another cause of further conflict across the globe. Because when people marry and have families, they like to settle down and they want to have a normal life. So that's another issue, and significant issue that needs to be paid attention to. Then, of course, there's this question of disparity in incomes. Some studies suggest that 20% wealthiest of the population own 85% of world's assets, and the 40% lowest basically own nothing, and that 40% live on an average of $1 or maximum $2 a day. And this disparity also is another cause of upheaval and problems in the world. Then we indicated that civil wars among nations, and genocide with horrific consequences still continue. We were talking about after World War II, basically from Cambodia in 1970s, and Guinea, and then later in Bosnia and Burundi and Rwanda and now Sudan, and many other countries, particularly African countries. This problem of genocide and civil wars and killing each other off continues, and of course now we have the problem in Libya and the turmoil in other Middle Eastern countries. And then in many of these dictatorships, torture and execution and imprisonment and abuse of dissidents and people who may have any kind of ideas which may be contrary to what the ruling class dictates continues in the most horrific manner. But today the young generation is rising up, and they see what is happening in Western democracies, and basically a semblance of balance and freedom and justice. None of these countries are perfect, but it's the situation and lifestyle is much better than many of those other countries. And so the young generation is seeing all this on the internet and then a new means of communication, and want to live a normal life like everybody else. In lieu of all of these, if you look closer at history, we can see some periods that we can say that that's a particular year or period that we need to pay attention to as to what happened. One such year was 1648. That was the year that the agreement was called Westphalia Agreement between Western nations was concluded, so that in place of war and hostilities, although it continued but not at that pace, we can go ahead and have ambassadors and consuls in different countries, and then if the problems arises, we can have dialogue. Another milestone was basically 1700s, we can say 1776, when we had the American Revolution, wanting independence from Britain, and then the French Revolution shortly after that, 1779, 89, and then together with this Industrial Revolution. A lot of positive, but at the same time negative, a lot of death and destruction, but at the same time these Western countries, Western economies, wanting to expand and explore and have access to raw materials, and then later cheap labor, and so that was the period of expansion of colonialism in the world. And so then we come to the year 1848, which is another milestone in the sense that that was the year that people of Europe had enough of despots and those kings, and so there was revolution after revolution and civil wars in all different countries, from France to Italy to Austria and other parts of the Western world, and so those kings were deposed, and it was the beginning of democracy and human rights and end of slavery and beginning of working toward equality between men and women, and beginning of women's suffrage. So we still have a long way to go. We go to all of these areas, but there has been tremendous improvement since 1848 with regard to these issues from that time. Then, of course, after World War I and that horrific carnage in Europe and elsewhere, we had the formation of legal nations in 1919, but that was not ratified by a number of countries, including the U.S. And I'd like to share with you some of the important milestones in the history of man toward unity and toward alleviating many of injustices that we see across the globe. Now, these dates are significant. I want to start with an important date, which is 1648. This was after the horrible religious wars of Europe, where millions lost their lives, and then they came up with an agreement, which is known as the Westphalia Agreement of 1648. Through this agreement, the countries of Europe, at least, and then expanded to other regions of the world, decided to send ambassadors and consuls to one another countries, so that if the conflict comes about, they can go and negotiate rather than beginning a war and having long hostilities with one another. Then another milestone came in mid 1700s, basically 1776 and 1789, with Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, which was the beginning of people thinking of their own rights and wanting to change societies. The next milestone comes perhaps to the year 1848, where many of the kings and rulers and despots of Europe were deposed, and it was the beginning of experimenting with democracy, at least in those regions of the globe. And then for human rights and for women's rights, and for safety nets, so that the worst off of humanity and those who are unemployed or can have minimal right of survival and subsistence living and all of that. So that was the beginning of that era. There were many other attempts, but another milestone is perhaps 1919, where the League of Nations was put in place after World War I. And although President Wilson of US was the initiator of it, but it wasn't ratified by US Congress and Germany and Russia, and so therefore it did not do what it was supposed to do, which was having a forum for all nations of the globe to come together to discuss issues and to stop wars forever. And so we ended up with World War II in 1940s, and right toward the end of World War II, that's 1945 to 1948, is when the United Nations was formed, and the Declaration for Human Rights was written, and many of the countries who came together for forming the United Nations and accepting its charters also signed the Declaration of Human Rights. But unfortunately, so many of them have violated those tenets and continue to violate, and do not abide by the human rights, which means freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom of basic rights of humans to be able to express themselves, and freedom of press, and all the rest of it. And there's so much violations of it all across the globe, leading to amazing levels of genocide, which has happened even in our century, in this century, and continues to happen. And something needs to be done about it. Perhaps the next milestone is 1990 to 1992, where President George Bush declared that this is a new world order. The Soviet Union was came down. US was the only superpower, and there was a hope of ending to wars and hostilities forever, and creating a new world order, a new balance in the world affairs. Genocides, wars, destructive force still continued until again in early 1990s, after the hostilities in Yugoslavia and the slaughter and imprisonment and torture of thousands of civilians, then a tribunal to bring to justice the Serb violators was put together, and those people were tried. Another milestone is 2002, where the criminal court or the International Court of Criminal Justice was approved and ratified by many countries of the globe, and it is now working to bring to justice the violators in the horrible massacre of Rwanda and some other African countries, and particularly the question of Sudan and the genocide that has taken place in that country. So these are important milestones of our era, with the hope that the next step would be again coming up with a loose federation of all the countries of the globe, so that they will put an end to war and hostilities and forever. According to the Baha'i Writings, the forces of construction and deconstruction are working together until we reach the time of total peace and harmony across the globe. So today I'd like to share with you some of these forces of construction. I just looked at the last few issues of periodicals like Time Magazine and Newsweek, and this is what I came up with. Well, one of these inventions of the past decade was the Facebook and Twitter. After the information revolution and coming of computers and email, we had that, and these forces led to more connection across the globe between people, and therefore the possibility of bringing democracy and understanding across the globe. I like to particularly refer to Wael Ghanim, this 30-year-old executive from Google in Egypt, who used the social media to bring about social change and peaceful change that he, together with his colleagues, were in effect successful in the case of Egypt. The other person I like to refer to is Ben Amour. He is a 21-year-old man known as El General in Tunisia, who had this poem that were sung across the region and about awakening people and peace and justice and avoiding corruption, which led to the downfall of the dictator in Tunisia just a few months ago. Another force of change, although in the short run it could be a cause of some problems for some countries, is WikiLeaks, which brought to light thousands upon thousands of secret documents, so that when countries and ambassadors and from different countries say something and then they act in effect something different, that would be brought to light. So therefore, in the future, hopefully we'll have more honesty in terms of relationships among nations. I'd like to refer to another person, Ron Bruder, from New York City, who, after the September 11th of 2001, he was a successful real estate developer. He decided to go to the Middle East and use his resources and his time for education, liberal education of young people in particular, and in teaching them interview skills and in finding jobs. And so he has been another positive force of the past decade. Then I have indicated this amazing sense of optimism in the Middle East, which so far has resulted in conviction of one dictator. Then in Africa, in the conviction of another dictator in absentia, and then the deposing of two dictators in the past year, and then another one probably on the way out, and then the remaining dictatorships are shaky at this time. Next, I picked up the question of population and population control, and noted that in 1960 the average birth per woman in the Middle East was 7 children. What is it today? It is 3. That's an amazing advancement in terms of women's education. Then I noted another amazing change, that in 2001, when Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, all across the country there were less than 1 million people who were enrolled in schools. I imagine primarily or exclusively probably men. What is it today? Over 6 million, and a large percentage of it women who are being educated. I like to refer to Maria Bashir, a 40-year-old strong woman in Afghanistan, who is the only female prosecutor who is fighting fearlessly for women's rights and against domestic abuse and threats to the life of women, in spite of threats to her own life. Next, I want to refer to you to Azim Premji, who is a successful businessman in India, who is in effect one of the people who brought the information revolution, so that was the cause of employment of millions of Indians who are working in India but are serving different countries through learning of computers and how to serve humanity from long distance. And he has been, Premji has been using his resources in teaching the young people, and in both on the job and also in training in schools in particular. I'd like to refer you to another brave person, Hu Shuli, a Chinese woman who is an advocate of free press, and she has been able to work through the system to gradually be able to expose tyranny and bring about gradual peace and harmony and understanding between the government and people of China and across the globe. Next, I want to refer to you to the dangerous trend of deficit in the United States, and indicate that in spite of that. So next, I want to refer you to the dangerous deficit situation in the U.S. It's approximately $14 trillion. Pretty soon it'll be equal to the gross national product of this country, and this amount of debt may be not sustainable, but according to the bipartisan commission of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, they have come up with a plan that if politicians in Congress can work on it, we'll be saved from this disaster, and we'll be able to pay off this debt gradually. Next, China and India have been a cause of pain for some Westerners because they think that they take away so many jobs and then they provide cheap labor, and therefore it causes imbalance in Western societies. This may be partially true, but at the same time, coming to the global nature of economics, we see that by their standard of living going up, they are able to buy goods and services, and in effect, many studies show that the recent recession, global recession, was partly saved because of the substantial amount of goods and services that Indians and particularly Chinese used in this time period. So it's not all bad news, and that provides some balance and equity across the globe by so many millions and millions of people not being in total poverty. Well, then I'd like to refer you to what's called rogue pastor, Bob Bell, who has written a book about salvation and hell, and has questioned the long tradition in the Christian church and among Christians that it's only Christians who go to heaven, and that or the nature of heaven and hell. And so he has questioned these, and he's a very brave man to be able to do this out of his own reflection and out of his own deeper understanding of the Bible, in spite of all the hurdles that he has faced. I also want to refer you to the disaster of tsunami in Japan, where thousands lost their lives and many towns and villages were destroyed. What good came out of that? It showed the gentility and the big heart of the average Japanese. So many of them volunteered to help their fellow man. And in this chaotic situation, there was little or no vandalism in this country. And particularly the youth rose up to serve their fellow man. This is great news. Well, I should also indicate the untiring work of artists, actors like George Clooney and Angelina Jolie and Matt Damon and many others who are working on the cause of refugee resettlement, the question of the war in Sudan, the question of water shortage in the world, and so on. Somebody who passed away a few years ago, the Senator Ted Kennedy, who spent many years of his life in defending the poor and defending the needy, and also in making sure that we get universal health care. I'd like to also mention Hillary Clinton, Senator Hillary Clinton, now the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who has devoted many years of her life, not only now but even previously, to the cause of women, to women equality across the globe, and now that as well as human rights, and in providing a semblance of balance in this chaotic world. Let me mention last but not least, President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, who is the first African American president, some 150 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and some 40 years or so after Martin Luther King's assassination. This is a truly miraculous feat in this country that finally, for the most part, many people have been able to deal with the question of race and work diligently on the question of equality of races, and also in appreciating someone who has been able to accomplish so much during his lifetime, and rewarding him the honor of presidency of this country. So this and many more are the good news, the forces of construction in our chaotic world. And if each one of us become a force, no matter how small and insignificant, toward the course of construction, perhaps in the next couple of decades we'll have peace on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you for your attention. Hello. I have some interesting statistics to share with you. There was an article in the recent issue of Time magazine says 1841 versus 2011. What are the similarities? And it shows that this was the year in 1848 where all of the despots and kings of Europe, from France to Italy, Austria and today's Germany and elsewhere were deposed. And they were dictators. People were oppressed, and food prices were expensive for the average person. So they couldn't take it anymore, and there was revolution all over. Now, today, it is the same scenario. Dictatorship, expensive food prices, unemployment, and oppression of the masses that we see from one corner of the Middle East to the other corner of North Africa. The same thing is happening until people get with the rights. Very interesting. There's another issue of a recent issue of Time magazine. There was another very interesting article, and this is what they call a prosperity index. They show the map of the world, and they have put certain criteria where what countries the rule of law applies, and there is real democracy, and private property rights are protected, and there's modern medicine, and there's work ethic, and there's true competition among people. Then science education has really improved, and there's adequate health care in those societies. And so they came up with this rating that the best countries of the world are in this order: 1, Norway; 2, Denmark; 3, Finland; 4, Australia; 5, New Zealand; 6, Sweden; 7, Canada; 8, Switzerland; 9, Netherlands; and 10, United States. As you see, most of these countries, that is 6 out of 10, are in Western Europe, then the rest North America, and then Australia and New Zealand. All of them democracies. All of them where there's two advances, and people are far better off as compared to other countries of the world. And then the darkest corners of the earth, Russia, and then all Middle East and Far East and most of Africa. So again, these imbalances would hurt all of us, and we need to address them. We need to be aware of them and see what can be done in these respects. Another very interesting article in the recent issue of Newsweek, where it says putting stars to work, and tells us what a lot of these movie stars are doing in conjunction with the United Nations, and the amount of good which is being done in order to alleviate poverty and inequities and water shortage and dealing with genocide and all the rest. A lot of these people, good people, are putting their lives in line and want to do some real good on earth, and it's something that we can all learn from. I'll just give you the list of what they have covered. George Clooney, of course, you know, is working tirelessly on the question of Sudan and the genocide there, and the upcoming, hopefully, independence of the South from North, where there's been so much hostility and so much cruelty in the past 3 decades. Bono is raising money to combat global poverty. He created programs like the One campaign and RED. He has met with world leaders to advocate debt forgiveness for developing countries. Sean Penn, on the question of relief, they founded a Haitian relief organization to aid with rebuilding. The group works on the ground in Haiti. It has provided temporary housing to 50,000 and medical care to many more. Alicia Keys founded Keep a Child Alive to provide medicine for HIV and support for AIDS orphans in Africa. She encourages youth in the US to complete their education with the From the Ground Up organization. Edward Norton is working on solar energy. He launched the fundraising site and runs Solar Neighbors, which donates solar energy systems to low-income families in South Central LA. Leonardo DiCaprio is working tirelessly on the question of environment. His foundation partners with other agencies to raise awareness of environmental issues. DiCaprio produced The 11th Hour, a documentary about global ecosystems in crisis. And many of us know, of course, about Angelina Jolie and her plight on behalf of refugees. As the UN's advocate for refugees since 2001, Jolie has visited more than 20 countries, including Haiti and Iraq, and with partner Brad Pitt, she started a foundation to fight rural poverty. Don Cheadle is working on the question of genocide, which is this terrible crime which has gone on really for too long. He co-wrote the book Not on Our Watch to educate the public on Darfur, then co-founded an anti-genocide advocacy group. Then the other person we have is Ben Affleck. He's working on the question of health. He addressed Congress in 2010 to secure funding for research into a genetic disorder called AT. In 2008 he visited Congo to raise awareness of the nation's escalating humanitarian crisis. We also have Matt Damon. He, in 2006, his film Running the Sahara depicted the water crisis in North Africa, and his group H20 Africa, which is now a water organization, provides microloans to communities for wells and sanitation, a critical issue where so many people are in danger of being hydrated because of not having adequate water. And then we have Prince Williams of Britain, who is working on the question of homelessness. The other thing I want to share with you is a map which I couldn't get in the colored form, a map of the world, the Freedom House. For some 60 years, Freedom House has been working on the question of assessing where the world is free, where it's not. Essentially, and they have an assessment of, in terms of where we have true democracy, where we don't have democracy, where we have freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and all the rest of it, and basically concludes that North America, part of South America, part of South Africa at this point, and then Australia and New Zealand, and all Western Europe, and now part of Eastern Europe after the break of Soviet Union, and then India are essentially could be considered free. There are some countries of the world which are probably partially free, but then essentially again all China and all Russia and part of the old Soviet Union and most of Africa and some places in South America are still considered totally unfree. a lot of brutality, a lot of inequities, a lot of tortures, and a lot of executions are happening because of absence of a level of justice and freedom for humanity. And we take our freedoms for granted, but we need to think of so many billions of oppressed people all across the globe. Another measure, which I believe started with the United Nations, is what is considered Quality of Life Index. This measure, they put together statistics from different aspects, different perspectives. From what I remember, the basic measures were life expectancy, literacy, healthcare, infant mortality, and per capita income. So the mix of these measures, and so they said that just having wealth is not enough. All these other factors of health and education and literacy and all the rest are equally important. And so they call it quality of life. And they came up with some measures. Depending on which factors they include and how they include it, the measures could be a little different from one group to another. But this one, which was mostly take into account where would be the most comfortable place for people to retire, came up with this measure. And in terms of rating, they rated number 1 France, followed with Australia, 3 Switzerland, 4 Germany, 5 New Zealand, 6 Luxembourg, 7 USA, 8 Belgium, 9 Canada, and 10 Italy. So that's also another interesting measure. So all of these tell us that gross national product is one measure, where we know that US is number 1 in that respect. We have the highest gross national product of any country in the world, followed with China, which was distant second, and then Japan. 4 is Germany, 5 is France, 6 UK, 7 Italy, 8 Brazil, 9 Canada, and 10 Russia. So this is in terms of gross national product, all goods and services. But of course that, if you break it down to on a per capita basis, it's a different story. Countries like Bermuda or Luxembourg and then Norway and Switzerland have the highest per capita income on the average, followed with US and then Japan and Denmark and then some other countries. So on a per capita income on the average. But then another measure which is important is what is the disparity between rich and poor. From what we can see is that the European and countries, and then followed with Australia, New Zealand and Canada, are doing a much better job in terms of equity than the United States. In the past 25 years or so, the disparity between the richest and the poorest man in this country has widened, has become worse. My orientation to globalism and world order began in my elementary school years. When I was going to school in elementary school, one of the first history lessons I learned was the beginning of the formal Persian history with Cyrus the Great. And what I learned from that period was that that king was a just king and a very tolerant king, and he had set up a means of communication so that all this region from the borders of India and China on the east and North Africa on the west could communicate with one another in the most efficient manner. And there was proper water and irrigation system. And most importantly, there was an amazing level of tolerance for all tribes, for all different groups and nationalities, and for all ways of religion. And that was one of the main reasons for the success of his kingdom at the time. It is said that part of the history of the time that when he invaded Babylon, actually the Babylonians, today's Iraq, they opened the gates and welcomed him, and without any major hostilities taking place. And then at that point he freed the slaves, and particularly the Jews, and promised to send them to whoever wishes, to send them to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and have them rebuild their temples, which was destroyed in previous hostilities. And not only that, but also promised them to support them, to support the funding, so that they can write the Holy Scriptures, which was the beginning of the written format of the Bible. So this was my initial orientation to globalism and world order, a healthy, viable world order. Beyond that, in my high school years, I was oriented to some major Persian poets of 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries in particular, who had a message of deep understanding of the human nature, and a message of love and harmony, and the essential oneness of the humankind. Beginning with Omar Khayyam of 10th, 11th century. He has a passage where he says, "Could you and I with him conspire to grasp this sorry state of things entire? Would we not shatter it to bits and then remold it to the heart's desire?" Basically, he's thinking of his lack of satisfaction with the hostilities that went on at the time, and why is it not that we cannot get together and bring peace and harmony to this world? Then the passage from Rumi, 13th century, that many of you recall, is this, when he says that, "What is to be done, O Muslims, for I do not recognize myself. I'm neither Christian or Jew, nor Gap nor Muslim. I'm neither of the East or of the West, nor of the land, nor of the sea. I'm not of India, nor of China, nor of Bulgaria, nor of Samarkand." Then he goes on, "My place is the placeless. My trace is the traceless. It is neither body or soul, for I belong to the soul of the beloved. I have put duality aside. I have seen that the two worlds are one. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call." So this is 13th century, where he's calling for the oneness of religion and the oneness of nations. And then we come to the next century, or shortly thereafter, 13th and 14th century. And here is a passage from Sa'di, another great philosopher, literarian, writer, poet of that time, in which he says, "Humanity is like the limbs of one body, or the members of the same family, because in creation we're all from the same stock. If one limb aches, the whole body aches." So this was the way Persians thought, and this was what was taught in the schools to the children who were growing up, to understand the necessity of oneness of religion and oneness of nations, oneness of races, oneness of humanity. And then we come to Hafez, where he says, "Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, 'You owe me.' Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky." Then we come to my academic orientation. In graduate school, when I chose globalism as my major field of study, and also received a certificate in global policy studies, and I was oriented to a number of books, a number of textbooks that I studied with regard to globalism in finance, in investment, in trade, in politics, and in different aspects of human endeavor. And then I continued my scholarship in this regard. So I'm going to share with you some of the basic sources in the study of globalism and world order. I begin with The Mainstream of Civilization by Chodorow and others, which provides a chronological view of human progress and setbacks through history from a sociologist's standpoint. Second book is called Taking Sides on Global Issues by James Harf and others. And this book provides a detailed analysis of critical global issues from various perspectives. Three, A Peace That Ended All Peace depicts the sheer terror and atrocities of World War I, where all measures of civility and humanity were lost in a 4-year state of terror that saw no end in sight. 4, Animal Farm and 1984, the two small books by this brilliant man, George Orwell, who was sick of these wars and atrocities. This was right shortly after World War II when he composed these books. And he dwells on the dark side of human being or psyche and the possibility of eventual takeover of the world by brutal and dictatorial regimes which would make robots out of humanity to satisfy the needs of those who control the rest of us. Something that we should always be careful so that even in democracy we're not brainwashed, and we can think for ourselves, we can decide for ourselves, and we can go to the core of our humanity and the core of our faith in terms of justice and equity and our own humanity. Another important book is Humanity by Jonathan Glover, and in this book he provides a critical account of humanity's brutality in the 20th century, including World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq wars, Cambodia, Afghanistan wars, Bosnia, and culminating with the civil wars of Africa, particularly the massacre in Rwanda, and leaves it for the reader to decide where we go from here. After the massacre of close to 1 million in Bosnia, in Rwanda, while the rest of the world simply stood by and watched people, men, women and children hacked to death and thrown to river. Glover talks to our conscience, saying, if you're serious about wanting to grow away from our barbaric past, the extra dimension has to be made central to ethics. Ideas about how to live should be shaped partly by the awareness of collective disasters. He also says in 20th century, some 100 million people were slaughtered in wars and genocides. This is over 100 people an hour, round the clock, for 100 years. Then he says, men love war because of seeing death close up. The excitement of killing and destruction and the heightened sexuality which is linked to all this. So sad, but this is what he claims. 6, Bernard Lewis's The Middle East provides a historical and analytical account of the history in which Abrahamic religions gave birth, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and provides a vivid picture of successes and failures that it embodies, culminating in Saddam Hussein's ruthless invasion of Kuwait, and leaving the world no other option but to repel the aggression. To have done otherwise, he concludes, would have made the UN totally irrelevant as the fate of the League of Nations had become at the outbreak of World War I. 7. Karen Armstrong, a prolific writer, the author of History of God, Battle for God, Crusades, Buddha, and Islam, shows the work of her work, and she wants to convey a picture of the origins of faith, which is for kindness and compassion and oneness and harmony and unity. And then the danger of its extremes, which becomes fanaticism and aggression, that she describes vividly in the battle for God among the religious extremists from all over the globe, particularly the West and the Middle East. 8. Will Durant, the author of the brilliant work The Story of Philosophy, chronicles advances of thought providing the foundations of democracy, human rights and ethics, from Socrates to Plato, Spinoza, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Henry Spencer, and Bertrand Russell, among others. That's an amazing work, concise work of the story of philosophy, and basically the progress of human mind, and the pitfalls and problems, as in that particular way how Nietzsche's mind developed in that sense. 9. Thomas Friedman, in his seminal work The World is Flat, chronicles advances in global communication and international commerce, and posits that the result would be freer trade and advances of humanity in reaching higher plateaus of achievement and material progress. There are some who have refuted some of his claims, but there are lots of truth in a lot of things that he says as well. 10. Produced shortly after the end of World War era, World War I, War II, Francis Fukuyama of Harvard University envisions persuasively the coming of age of humanity and the eventual success of democracy, freedom, and Western values for a tired and tried humanity, in his famous work The End of Humanity and the Last Man. 10. Shortly after Fukuyama's authorship, Samuel Huntington of the same institution cautions Fukuyama in his work, The Clash of Civilizations, that although the Soviet Union does not exist any longer, but it is also the beginning of disintegration of global order and the beginning of civil and tribal wars all across the globe. We have seen many of it, of these atrocities, in Asia, in South America, in Europe, and particularly in Africa after World War II. And it still continues. And the last episode is the atrocities in Libya. And we'll have to see how that would end. Thank you for your attention.